Then James, he says it's not God who tempts us. We're tempted by our own desire. Let's talk about that desire here for a moment. At the core of every human being, there is this profound desire, this longing, this disenchantment. As Bruce Springsteen said many, many, many years ago, everybody's got a hungry heart. We're born with a hungry heart. Now, hearts are supposed to be red because it's supposed to be filled with blood. But our brilliant creative team made this heart black because it's a hungry heart. It's longing for that which will give it life. It's a hungry heart. And see, that hungry heart isn't a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing. God created us with that hungry heart because God wants to pour his life and his fullness into us. God is to be to us what blood is to the heart. He's to make our life pump. And so God puts this in us as sort of as I often say around here, a homing device. It's there to drive us. This hunger is there to drive us again and again and again back to God as our source of life, our source of worth and significance and security. So that hungry heart is a good thing. The problem is that we live in a fallen world where there are deceptive things all around us all the time that look like they could give us life. Things that look like the red blood that our heart is hungry for. And they promise life, these things, these activities, they promise life, but in fact, it's false life because in embarking on that, we are heading down a path of emptiness and destruction. We're surrounded by false life. But the fact that it looks like life entices us. And this is the second stage of a temptation. This is really the root of all temptation, this enticement. And so here, this thing that we think will give life, that's why we have it red. It looks like the blood that the heart longs for. It's calling us over to itself. And we're drawn by that. All around us there are things that say, hey, listen, if you do this, if you get this, I'll satisfy you. I'll give you a fullness of life. I'll meet a need in your life. I'm what you're longing for. And so it entices us. Now, it's important for us to know that the fact that you're tempted is not itself a sin. Because James says that we're enticed, and then that can lead to a sinful desire being conceived, which then can lead to giving birth to sin. So temptation itself is not sin. And Hebrews 4:15 tells us that Jesus was tempted in every way just like we are, and yet he never sinned. So clearly, to be tempted is not sin. Now that's an important distinction to make, because if we don't clearly distinguish between being tempted to sin and sin itself, we can fall into one of the enemy's number one traps. And that is to think that we've already sinned just by virtue of the fact that we're being tempted. And if we think we've already sinned, we've already fallen, well then we stop resisting the temptation, which is the very thing that causes us to fall into the sin that was tempting us. Very common strategy. When I was a new Christian and a young man, I fell into this trap all the time. Like a lot of young men and women, I had a big struggle with lust. I'm sure no young people can relate to that today, but back in those days, we struggled with that a little bit. And I'll say this, one of the benefits of getting older, there aren't many, but one of the benefits of getting older is that your hormones become a little bit more manageable. And so all of us 50 and over crowd can say to you younger folks, the good news is that 30, 40 years from now, you won't be struggling quite as much, so take heart. There you go. But when I was 16 and 17, I felt like I was a walking hormonal lust bomb, and anything could set me off. I was enticed by everything. It was just crazy. And so you'd see something random, or you'd think something random, and so your hormones would start racing, and then I would think, oh, I fell into it again. I thought I blew it. And I let my guard down, which would be the very thing that would then cause me to fall into it. And then the devil jumps on your back and accuses you and tells you what a loser you are, and you knew this was going to happen, and you're never going to succeed. So to medicate that, the pain of that shame, you fall further into sin. And I would find myself going on these sin binges for a day or two or a week, whatever. I'm sure some of you can relate to that as well. Don't fall into that trap. The fact that you're tempted does not itself mean that you're sin. Look I don't care how old or how young you are, you're going to face temptations. Jesus faced temptations, you're going to face temptations. And that's just part of what it is to be a human being in a fallen world. It is not itself sin. What matters is how you respond. Do you resist it and set it aside, or do you yield to it and give into it? And if you yield to it, well, then you're moving on to the next stage of temptation in this tempt, sin, death process. If we yield to that false life, our heart gets fused with that enticement. And now we have conceived a sinful desire in our heart. And this is the second stage of temptation. We could call it conception. So there's enticement. There's enticement that then leads to conception. And here, the analogy that James is drawing is between the way sin is conceived, a sinful desire is conceived in our heart, and the way that a new child is conceived. The way that a sperm and egg come together to conceive a new child. When you're just being enticed by something, your desire is still towards God. It's just being bent a little bit. There's still a space between you and the enticement. But if we yield to that enticement, now we've invited it in, and it grips our heart and begins to choke our heart.